I'm making a quick follow-up video on Eileen Wood. I mentioned about how she was satisfied with what she had. Eileen Wood died 3 months and 2 days, 3 months and 2 or 3 days before her 87th birthday. Eileen Wood God was in heaven, with whom she's with tonight, with her late husband, Alan, her saintly, wonderful son, Bobby, her wonderful father, Carl, and her mother, Mary, and her mother-in-law, Mrs. Johnny Wood, Jessie, and her father-in-law, certain Johnny Wood himself. Wonderful people, all those 7 people I mentioned. Eileen Wood went to work very young. She went to work she was born in Lusterdale along the Havendale River in Guysborough. It's Lusterdale, Havendale, and Guysborough, Innerville, and so on. She was Lusterdale. Her father had a small, modest store. Stuff was dirt cheap then. It was very hard to make any money. And he fished. And he fished every species there was out there available. And from his own mackerel in the spring to make for bait, lobsters. Later on it'd be probably salmon or trout or codfish in those days, and smelts in the spring or in the fall run, and eels probably through the ice in the winter. And she made the comment that she worked anyway. Back to her first job. Her first job was at a family that had a special needs child, a son, and big family, and the mother wasn't very healthy, and she helped them out as a domestic in the house, doing cooking and cleaning and a lot of stuff that mothers would normally do, and maybe the lady wasn't able to do all herself. And she worked at a very young age. She remembers when World War II ended. It was May 8th of 1945. She remembers the few trucks there were, and it was radio, came over radio in the afternoon, that Siege of Ex-Mannequin-ish, was the only radio station area, that World War II had ended. And people hugged in tears of joy, and few trucks that went by tooted that World War II had ended after 6 years, from September 1939 to May of 1945, so best part of 6 years. She worked at the Goshen restaurant at Lower St. River. She met Colonel Sanders. Eileen met Colonel Sanders. Colonel Sanders wore white. It symbolized purity and cleanliness. And he stayed at the Goshen restaurant in the quarters up there. Her brother Leo worked there. She worked there, and they'd stay upstairs, the staff, and he'd come down in the morning and he'd tell them, smile. If you knew how many muscles it took to frown, you'd always smile. Now, nobody had to tell Eileen Wood to smile. Eileen Wood was a smiley cat. Okay, cats and kids are great judge of character, and Eileen loved cats, and cats loved Eileen. And as Johnny Wood loved cats, by the way, her saintly father-in-law. And anyway, she met Colonel Sanders. Very few people can say that. And he was just like he was on the Colonel Sanders' Boys and the Bucket of Chicken. And she met Colonel Sanders and was with him for about a day and a half back in the 1950s. In the winter, when the bus tours and tour season would stop, she worked at the Brigadoon restaurant on Anniganish Main Street, where the Bank of Nova Scotia is now. And she lived in a boarding house. And she was a very young girl, teenager by then, and she took in first jobs at probably 13 or 14. She was in her teen years when she worked at the Brigadoon restaurant in the wintertime, and she saved money, and she saved $60, and I don't think the family had a refrigerator back then. And she'd come home and she brought $60, and the father had a tobacco can. He'd smoke tobacco, as I said, he smoked, and he'd make his own, and it was Zigzag, Sweet Capital, McDonald's, whatever the brand of tobacco was in those days, and he had this can on top of the shelf in the kitchen, and that's where he saved his money. And that $60 that wonderful saintly lady brought home, oldest daughter, second oldest of the children of Mary and Carl Marr, was to buy, so her father could buy some lats to make his traps. They weren't buying pre-made traps or wire traps then. Buy some lats from the local little sawmill to make his traps, and buy some twine to knit his heading. And they put ballast rock in, they get on the beach, and maybe some spindles to put the bait in, and so on. And so does all those younger brothers and sisters owe a debt of gratitude to their oldest sister Eileen. That's the kind of totally unselfish woman she was. She took that hard-earned $60, found her way home to Lusterdale, and put that $60 in the can on the shelf in the kitchen where her father saved the money to buy material to make traps. And those are two important points. So the generosity and kindness of the lady, consideration of her, meeting Colonel Sanders, and her God was not a four-wheeler or side-by-side. Her God wasn't a fancy house. Her God wasn't a hardwood floors. Her God wasn't a Chesterfield. Her God was in heaven. And this is the man that she faithfully prayed for. And when she couldn't get to church in later years, she watched that daily TV Mass once or twice a day on Vision Television, the Catholic television network. And she prayed to God faithfully every day. And that is why I can say with confidence, Eileen Wood ascended to heaven earlier today, about now 18 hours ago. And all the best, God bless, and God bless God for sending this wonderful, kind lady, an example to all of us. This wonderful lady that was on earth for 87 years almost, when in a few months she was on her 87th year, almost 87 years old. And one more little story. Some in the community turned 93 on the 2nd of August, and Eileen was not without wit. The 2nd of August, and his wife turned 94 on the 12th of September. So they're for 6 months of the year, instead of 6 weeks of the year, a month and a half of the year, they're the same age, from August 2nd to September 12th, about 5.5, 6 weeks. So I said, did you know that so-and-so is older? They call it cougar, coyote. Cougar's the name. Women that go for younger men. And this other lady's marriage is now in a 60-some year, and Eileen was extremely faithful to her husband, as was Alan extremely faithful to his wife. Very good marriage. And so anyway, she said, it was the same with me and Alan. I said, I didn't realize that, she said. And a little impish grin come over her face. And she said, I said, what's the difference between you and Alan in age? She said, 9 months. And she said to me, so John, she said, I was coming out when Alan was going in. You can take that for what it means. So she said, I was coming out. She was being born to her lovely mother Mary, and her father Carl, as Johnny and saintly Johnny Wood and his equally saintly wife Jessie were procreating to make Alan Wood, who about 20 years later would become her wonderfully, blissfully married husband. And so Eileen was not out with wit and humor. She was a pleasure to know. Eileen was a pleasure to know, and she had wit in her and humor and honesty and decency. And with that, I gotta go. I'm almost at the 9-minute mark again. It was supposed to be brief. Thank you very much. God bless. Good night.